Hello and welcome to another edition of The Front Page on GNAT-TV. My name is Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal, and I'll be your host today. And today it's my pleasure to have with us in the studios here at GNAT, Congressman Peter Welch. Congressman, welcome to GNAT.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Great to have you back again. As many of you know, Peter Welch first entered politics in Vermont in 1980 as a state senator from his home county of Windsor, served for 8 years in the state Senate. Took a hiatus from politics for a little while, but returned in 2001, also as a state senator from Windsor. Served as the president pro tem of the Senate until 2006, when he was elected to Congress for the first time, and was just reelected last November for what will be his fourth term. Well, Congressman, you've just come in from a Congress in Your Community event, one of the several events that you hold around the state from time to get the pulse of the voters, I guess, and find out what they're interested in. You just had one up in Manchester at Mrs. Murphy's Donuts. So I thought it might be kind of fun just to kind of start things off, to kind of turn the tables a little bit and let you be the reporter and tell us what were some of the things folks were talking about or interested in up at the restaurant.
Well, it was pretty lively, and a lot of the issues that came up were state issues. There were some folks that were pretty angry about break-open tickets. That's something that's got to be dealt with in Montpelier. It's not my jurisdiction. Right. And property taxes came up. A lot of folks were talking about property taxes, and I understand that. Anybody who owns property is always apprehensive about the cost of the property taxes going up. But again, not in my jurisdiction. But there were a lot of other issues. The guns came up in both sides. A woman I met on the way in was in favor of very strong gun control, and a lot of the folks inside were extremely concerned about encroaching on the Second Amendment. So that was a very lively topic. Immigration came up. Also a lively topic. Congressional dysfunction.
No
we're not working.
There.
Yeah. The word is out. Congress is not working that well. Manchester's figured that out. So that came up. Budget issues was a topic as well. So it was a lively interaction with people on a range of issues. But you know what? Bottom line, pocketbook issues I think are really concerning people. And then, is the federal government going to get in their way of hunting and Second Amendment rights? That was a concern inside the number of people raised.
Oh, sure. Well, that's obviously a very, very big issue for everyone, essentially.
Everyone,
and
sure.
Obviously, the dominant issue in last November's election. So just to kind of segue off of that then, we're here on February 22nd, a week or so before the famous or infamous sequester deadline is supposed to come into effect in Congress on March 1st. But the show will be on the air after that. So just to try and talk a little bit about this kind of from both sides of that deadline, what do you make of this whole sequester situation? And I guess secondly, how do we ever get away from this business of seeming to only be able to make hard decisions when faced with absolute deadlines like we saw with the fiscal cliff situation a few weeks ago, and now this? It seems like Congress has a hard time planning long term.
Well, you're right about that. Well, two things. First of all, let me explain what the sequester is. It's a very dumb idea. It is across-the-board spending cuts to the Pentagon and across-the-board spending cuts to the domestic budget. So the Pentagon, it's a meat-cleaver approach. It's not asking the military to come up with, all right, how will you save $84 billion in the next year? It's just an across-the-board cut. So whether we need it or we don't, whether it's waste or it's important, there's no distinction made. So this is what makes the across-the-board approach really stupid. And it's the reason I voted against it. The same thing is true in the domestic discretionary budget. If we're going to make cuts there, by the way, we made $1.5 trillion of cuts on the domestic budget. And that's a lot of things. It's like aid to higher education, our kids going to college, medical research, National Science Foundation, agricultural programs, conservation programs. It's a lot of things that are important and have been cut back. Again, across the board cut. So there's two reasons that are, I think, problematic with that approach. One, if you're running a business or even your household and you're under financial stress, you actually pick and choose decisions about where can you cut. You might cut out everything. You might get rid of cable TV altogether, even though you'd like it. You just can't afford it. But you wouldn't cut back to nothing on food, all right? You got to take care of the kids. you'd exercise judgment. Well, the government with this sequester doesn't do that. Boom, across the board.
Well, I gather the idea was considered to be so bad and so horrible and so nasty that, well, of course we wouldn't wind up doing that.
Well, that's right. But I just want to finish with the other the criticism of it. The second is we've got a very fragile economy, and there's some signs that it's getting a little better. It's certainly not as bad as it was in '08, but this is a long, hard climb out of a recession. And for average folks, they're going paycheck to paycheck, and they're worried about their job. Most economists think that this abrupt reduction in governmental support and spending is going to have a negative impact on the economy and could derail the recovery. So that's another reason that I was opposed to this sequester, doing it this way. So what happens whether folks are watching before or after March 1, they'll know that the sequester goes into effect. In fact, I don't think there'll be much of an immediate impact.
Right.
People won't feel it. The life will be the same on March 2nd as it is on March 1. The next deadline where it really is consequential is March 27, because the spending authority for all of government expires on that date. So the real negotiations are probably going to take place in the month of March to see if we can come up with a more sensible, thoughtful approach to getting our budget in order, but doing it in a practical, thoughtful way.
Do you think there's any likelihood that that will happen, or will we just come up against this later deadline towards the end of March?
Well,
and we'll have the same kind of loggerheads kind of situation.
Here's the problem. It should. If we got the 25 Vermont, if we got the folks at Mrs. Murphy's this morning to sit around and listen to what the budget situation was, they'd come up with, I really do believe this, a balanced approach where we'd get some revenues, get rid of a lot of tax loopholes, and we'd cut some spending in places where we could do that without hurting folks or the economy. We'd be able to do it. Congress can't. Now, why is that? We've been lurching from crisis to crisis, and they're all self-manufactured. We almost turned the lights off in government 2 years ago. Right. Then we had the debt ceiling, where we literally had a debate in Congress as though it were optional that America pay its bills. I mean, that doesn't make sense.
Right.
And then we had the fiscal cliff, and now we have the sequester, and then we're going to have the lights off in government on March 27. And you know what? People have concluded, and they did at Mrs. Murphy's, Congress is the problem. We have serious problems. They're solvable, including our fiscal situation. And the dilemma in Congress is that it's become much more of a debating society where ideological purity is much more important than practical progress. And that's the impediment. And it's so different from my experience when I worked in the Vermont State Senate. We had a lot sharp disagreements between Republicans and Democrats. But when we were on a committee, like I served on the Finance Committee, we'd be in the same room every afternoon for 4 months, hearing the same witnesses at the same time, and we come to two things. One, some common understanding of what the problem was. We didn't each make up our own facts. And in Congress, it's kind of a fact-free zone, and everybody makes it up as they go along. And that's destructive for getting an end result. The second thing that happened when we were in that same room, working together day in and day out, is the people in January that you really disagreed with, as you got to know them by March and April, you saw that, yeah, we were different, but you came to appreciate that their goal was to make Vermont a better place, just like you hoped your goal was. Right. So it created this desire to find the common ground as opposed to accentuate the differences. And we don't do that in Congress. We don't spend enough time together. We're in a committee where the witnesses who come in are usually selected so that they can appeal to the cameras as opposed to give us good information. The Republicans sit on one side of the room, the Democrats sit on the other, and there's a real limitation on our ability to actually get to know each other and to find the common ground. And it's one of the reasons why I've gotten so actively involved with this new group called No Labels, which essentially is about 25 Republicans, 25 Democrats, and we span the range of ideological opinions from very conservative to very liberal. But the thing we share is that we all understand our job is to find principled compromise. Compromise can't be a four-letter word if we're going to make any progress.
Right.
And, you know, Congress has got to heal itself in order that we can make decisions that that institution, Congress, has to make in order for America to be successful.
That's a fascinating discussion that if we had more time, I would love to explore more. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of issues in play here between, well, the redistricting of Congress over a long period of time, which seems to have resulted in more polarized districts where
Very
the
good
real
point.
election is the primary,
That's right.
not so much the general election in November.
Well, you know, just on that point, you're exactly right. I'll have the number a little bit wrong, but it makes your point. About 95, 6, 7% of the Republicans are from districts that Governor Romney won, and about 95 or 6% of the Democrats are from districts that President Obama won. So there are very few swing districts now. And a lot of my colleagues, particularly on the Republican side, it's tougher there these days, but it could happen on our side as well. Their big apprehension is the primary. You know, whoever the Republican nominee is in some districts, and likewise Democratic nominee in Democratic districts, are going to win. But the primary is what they fear. So I had last year some Republicans who were very supportive of energy efficiency legislation that I was sponsoring, and they wanted to be on it. But the political folks said, hey, you get on that with the Democrat, then you could get yourself in a primary. And, you know, that's a bad commentary on how Congress is working these days.
Well, it's a complicated subject, and one which we'll have to talk about some more at some point down the road, perhaps. But I guess I wondered if maybe we could continue on with a little bit about the whole spending crunch and problems that, like you said, Congress seems to struggle to kind of plan long term or find a good balance. I mean, do you see a time coming when we are going to be able to find good compromises that are acceptable across the range of, you know, the spectrum of Congress on taxing and spending, where, let's say, wealthier Americans will be taxed a little bit more, but, you know, some kind of cuts, for lack of a better term, on some programs that seem to be the heart of the financial problem that the country faces with a $16 trillion or so debt.
Well, we have
from
to.
things like Medicare and Social Security, which are very popular.
Right.
Virtually all Americans seem to want them, and then any talk of cutting back on any of that is sort of a sacred cow kind of situation. But how do we get around that problem?
Well, I think we're lurching our way towards recognizing that we've got to do it, because I'll say this, a lot of my Republican colleagues after the election tell me that they heard from their voters the same thing I heard from Vermonters. And what I heard from Vermonters was this: Peter, why don't you guys get together and get something done? It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be progress.
Right.
And on the budget, there's been an ideological battle, especially in the Republican House. It's a majority of Republicans. And there was a substantial number of Tea Party folks whose goal was not to make it more efficient. It was to really unravel government, to get rid of a lot of government, in an opinion that many of them had, that these institutions of government were impediments to liberty. And obviously, government can be too big, it can be inefficient, it can be too regulatory, but the goal, I think, has to be to make it work, to make it lean, inefficient. But the common ground that we could get would require Democrats to give as well. And I think there's three areas where we could make some progress. One, on the tax code, why don't we start with getting rid of the tax giveaways, the tax breaks that everybody knows are essentially special interest oriented, don't help the economy, and are out of reach for most average citizens. You know, a couple of examples. When an industry is profitable, do they need continued taxpayer assistance? I think most of us would say no. They're doing good in the market. They don't need extra money from the taxpayer. You know, why do we have oil industry tax breaks of $40 billion when that industry is doing very well? $1 trillion in profits in the past 10 years. So let's clean up the tax code. Second, the Pentagon. I mean, the Pentagon budget since 9/11 has exploded. It's got to make a contribution to debt reduction. And in fact, in order to have a strong national defense, you've got to have robust funding, but it's got to be lean. You can't just throw money at it and think that solves the problem. And then the third area that's, I think, the most contentious and toughest for the Democrats is that we do have to do something on health care. The cost of health care is going up faster than we can afford. And we have 10,000 citizens a day becoming eligible for Medicare. So the pressure on our budget is enormous. And the big challenge for us is to find ways to bring the cost of health care down. And the debate in Congress is about whether you do that through reforms like prescription drug price negotiation, which would save $150 billion, or this bundling of payments where you get much more efficient care at lower cost, these are the way that Vermont is pioneering. Or do you do it by just slashing benefits, but leaving intact this healthcare system that is too expensive, whether it's Medicare, private employer, sponsored healthcare for their workers, or individual payment. So we've got to address the healthcare cost situation, and that would help in Medicare, and it would help in healthcare in general. So we've got healthcare, we've got the Pentagon, and we've got the tax code.
Well, that's an ambitious agenda. I wish you well on all three fronts. That will keep you all, I'm sure, busy well into the evenings down there in Washington. Well, let's turn to a couple of the points that you mentioned earlier that came up this morning at Mrs. Murphy's. Gun control, obviously, is one, and certainly in the wake of the Newtown, Connecticut tragedy there back in December. That is an issue that's kind of, shall we say, to understate it considerably, gotten a lot more prominent. But there's a real division, I guess, between folks who feel that their Second Amendment rights should be protected, and those who feel that there should be some greater restrictions, either through background checks or limits on the size of the number of bullets in a magazine, or banning assault weapons altogether. So where do you come down on that question, first of all, and do you see a compromise in the offing somewhere at some point later on this year?
I think, first of all, everybody is horrified about Newtown, and it has made it different. I mean, these were 6- and 7-year-old kids, some who got shot 9, 10 times. And, the strongest pro-Second Amendment folks are, we've got a great tradition of responsible use of firearms in Vermont. But the folks in Vermont who were longtime firearms users are as horrified about what happened in Newtown as Vermonters who have never held a gun. So there's universal horror at that. And I think some willingness on the part of everybody to say, hey, look, are there some common sense things that we can do that are consistent with the Second Amendment, which does confer rights on individual citizens to have access to firearms? And there's a lot of anxiety, because if you're a Second Amendment person, the fear is that it's a slippery slope, and if government does anything, then next thing you know, government will be trying to take guns away, which is not the case, but that's an apprehension. And what I've heard is, and here's the other thing we have to acknowledge: no matter what law we pass, there's no guarantee that this kind of event, it won't be perfect, and we can't pass a law. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could, that would guarantee that we wouldn't have this kind of senseless violence in the future? But the common sense things that I think have some potential are the background checks. And in fact, I think a background check probably is the most important, because to the extent that we can make it very tough for people who right now are not legally entitled to have a gun, or people who shouldn't have a gun from having one, whatever kind of gun it is, that's probably going to be very helpful. A second area that's more controversial, but I think has some promise, is how big a magazine clip do you have? Because there is some evidence that when these people who are deranged have high-capacity clips, like in the Gabby Giffords case, that allows them to do more harm in a short period of time. But there's a lot of gun folks who debate that and what's the right size. But that's an area where I think we ought to have an open-minded discussion. Then when you get to the specific weapons, that's where it gets the most controversial, because weapons of combat, we all know, shouldn't be privately held. I mean, we don't have rocket grenade launchers, and we don't have automatic weapons or machine guns. But the automatic weapon ranges, or the semi-automatic ranges from 22s that are a rifle and have generally been improved, to some of the AR-15s, which a lot of our sportsmen, it's been modified from the combat function, and a lot of our sportsmen use those. And there's a lot of debate about how do you make that definition. And in fact, in the prior assault weapon ban during the Clinton years, there were a lot of loopholes in there. So that's going to be the biggest challenge, and it's going to be taken up for discussion in, as you know, Senator Leahy's Judiciary Committee. So, you know, my hope is that, A, there's mutual respect. If there's common sense we can do, common sense things that we can do that are going to help avert another massacre like that, then I think all of us want to be able to take those steps. But we want to do it in a way where we need the Second Amendment folks to be with us at the table to make sure that we're acting in a way that's consistent with their rights. And I think we can make some progress in ways that assure folks that the Second Amendment is going to be honored. We are very fortunate in Vermont because we've got this family tradition and a tradition of enormous responsibility. But you know what? I think all of us have to acknowledge that if whatever happened in Newtown or happened somewhere else, it's just the luck of the draw.
It could happen here.
Yeah,
in theory.
And, you know, and that's the focus on the mental health issues, where obviously we've been neglectful as a society in providing the mental health services that some people clearly need.
Right. And that's another really, it strikes me anyway as being a very tricky question. I mean, number one, there would be the financial piece. We would have to invest more money in greater and expanded range of mental health services, but also, how do you identify someone who may be troubled or may be, you know, kind of just one step away from going off into a Newtown-like situation?
That's right.
I mean, that's a Big Brother type of scenario that could easily...
That's right, and it may well be that it has to be folks who have some specific adjudication where there's some process, because, you know, you raised the practical dilemma. If somebody's got a mental health issue, you want them to get access to mental health so they can get what they need and get healthy. So you don't want to have a deterrent that if somebody goes and sees a counselor about anything, suddenly they no longer can hunt and fish. You know?
Right.
So figuring that out is very, very tough. But there are some folks who've been adjudicated, or some folks who have a criminal record, not related to mental health, but just conduct, where there's an adjudication with due process rights. That's a fairly easy way to do it, because if you get on that list, you know, then you are a person who would be prohibited from having access to a firearm.
Okay. Well, one last question, and you mentioned again earlier about immigration that apparently came up with your conversation this morning. I mean, Vermont isn't often thought of as being one of those sort of states on the forefront of the immigration controversy, if I might use that term. But we do share a border with Canada, and we do have workers come in from overseas to work on our farms here. And I know it's been a bit of an issue here as well as nationally. And obviously we saw it last year, again, during the election, that it did become a much bigger issue than it might have been, let's say, a year or so ago. Do you think the time is ripe now for some kind of overarching immigration reform, or are we going to see just sort of more back and forth trading blows?
I actually have some optimism about immigration reform. It's a touchy issue because people who came here illegally, oftentimes driven by economic necessity and desperation and the desire to help their family and better themselves, did come here illegally, okay? So people rightly say, well, wait a minute, they broke the law. And it may be understandable, but there's a lot of folks in this debate that have said, hey, they've got to go back. And then there's the practical question, if there's 11 million or so illegals here, and then they have kids who are here, how on a practical level do you do it? Then there's the other question that we have very much here in Vermont. You know, our farms, our cows wouldn't be milked if we didn't have immigrant labor. And our farmers tell me that. You know, I've been out to farms and I've talked to them, and they cannot get the local labor to milk their cows. So there's a practical question. You know, if we had no access to immigrant labor, we may not have many, if any, farms. So is there a way to have a discussion that's not loaded up as just a political sledgehammer? And the reason I think it's changed is two things. Number one, the election. It really made a difference. The Hispanic vote was very favorable to President Obama and was very hostile to Governor Romney, whose position was, quote, self-deportation. So there's an acknowledgement politically on the part of the Republicans in Congress now that they've got to do something about it. And then secondly, there's a recognition that if we do something that has a path to citizenship that requires you pay fines, you're square with the law, you learn English, all of these things that are indicia of being an American citizen, and it takes a lot of time, that we may be able to reach some compromise. A lot of people still don't like it because that person came in, quote, they came in illegally. They didn't have papers. But there's a practical level requirement that we somehow get to a status quo here that includes much more stringent border enforcement that we've had for the past several years.
Seems like we've come very close on a couple of occasions to coming up with legislation that would have either created pathways to citizenship or somehow dealt with the illegal immigration problem. I think 2006, 2008, Senator McCain came up with a bill where there was
Senator McCain did.
And President Bush also was endorsing it at one point, a bill that would have seemed to have, kind of created that pathway and sort of gotten us out of this this problem to some degree.
Right, and it's been a very volatile political issue because it just rubs people the wrong way that you can, that quote, you can get amnesty for an illegal entry. And that's pretty understandable, but when you look at the human situation, oftentimes you can understand why somebody, a mom or a dad, will take desperate measures if that's the only way they can get a job and feed their kids.
Sure.
You know what I mean? So, so is there a way we can move towards getting this fixed, and just for practical reasons, and for the benefit of the American economy and human, and to alleviate the kind of human strain.
Sure. Well, as always, Congressman Welch, I'm sure we could talk for another half an hour about many other things that are front and center issues for all of us. But I guess we're just about out of time right now. So I just wanted to thank you again for making the time.
Thank you.
What I know is a very busy schedule today to come and share some of your thoughts with us. And
pleasure to be here.
And pleasure to have all you folks watching as well. And this has been The Front Page on GNAT-TV. My name's Andrew McKeever. We'll see you the next time. Thank you.